Welcome back to International NCRP. You are now, congratulations, more than halfway through your course, and I know it's challenging, these distance classes. They go by so quickly. We condense 15 weeks of campus material into 12 for all of you. So hopefully you all had a moment to give me your candid feedback by email last week, telling me what is working best for you in the course, anything you would like me to change, and giving me requests for anything you hope I could focus on in the last half of class. If you didn't have a minute to drop me an email, please do so now. Some of you have never had me as a professor before, but those of you who have, I certainly don't use your feedback to affect your grade or anything in the course. I value it. It helps me teach you in the best possible ways. Well, we only have a few more weeks left, and most of you know that I received a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies earlier. Actually, I received the Fulbright Chair last year, and I went to PUC, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil for the first half of this year. So I have promised you I would spend some time talking about my experience there and Brazil. And before I turn to the PowerPoint for my lecture today, I want to give you a little background. I also spent a sabbatical, a semester in India 3 years ago. And if I know some of you have economics background, work in finance and business, and so you're probably well aware of the term that was coined a few years back, BRICS. BRICS was coined, well actually BRIC without the S, without South Africa, was coined to talk about the emerging global economies. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Now, I don't have time to go into details about their economies and how they were chosen, but the term has stuck, and it is interesting to be watching these countries. Probably the United States has had the most knowledge and relationship, especially positive relationship with China. That could be a whole course in itself, discussing how that happened and why, and how that may have hurt the United States in many ways. I'm not going to have the time to do that. But I will say that I have had the opportunity now to live and teach and do research in the two multicultural democracies of the BRIC. Never have spent time in South Africa, the newest of the democracies, but have had many South African colleagues. So that is the background for some of what I will be reviewing in future weeks. Let me turn to the PowerPoint now for the remainder of my lecture. Today I would like to focus on exploring Brazil's potential for transforming and shaping international conflict resolution. Now, I have introduced to you the present status quo. The US and Western nation states dominate international conflict resolution with a carrot-stick approach. Part of why I was interested in studying Brazil as I was there is because Brazil has attempted to be an advocate for the global South and balance power in relation to Western dominance. Now, they actually have a scholar, the most famous scholar. I don't know if any of you have read Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Paulo Freire's influence is global, and his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which he wrote while in exile. Brazil, if you know the history at all, has had military dictatorships like other Latin American countries. And he, as a professor of extended education, working with the poorest and the illiterate of Brazil, was inspired to write Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which, if you have not read it, promotes dialogue as an alternative to force. In fact, next week, I hope to focus more on introducing his philosophy and approach to all of you. It's quite relevant to NCRP. Right now, unless some of you are high school or elementary school educators who have studied his pedagogy as part of teacher education, you might not know much. But I promise I will fill you in on some of what I find most impressive. I believe his model, which actually was a model for within his nation state, for dialogue between the elite of Brazil and the oppressed, is a model that I believe could be used to promote truly inclusive international process. It would be a consistent voice for including all of the global South, the developing nations, in what is now an exclusionary international process behind closed doors. And I have met diplomats over the last 15 years from countries like, for example, Madagascar, those representing Mediators Without Borders. I may have mentioned one of our alumni who was at the climate change negotiations. They routinely will describe Western players getting together behind closed doors and excluding their presence, their voices, their influence. Now, as I said, Brazil is an advocate for the global South, and that is done without any apologies. They are attempting to balance power and advance equal treatment, participation at the table. They are not pretending to be an impartial mediator. But interestingly enough, part of why I believe I went to PUC Rio, and if you take the time to Google this prominent Catholic university, private university in Brazil, you will see that it's quite renowned and well respected. In fact, the University of California system has such a collaborative partnership with PUC that they have pretty much funded the international education unit of the university. But they do not just have US or California alliances. Columbia University is another university in the US where international faculty and students have had exchanges. They also have strong international support, and Norway has funded a unit to study mediation in the global South in Brazil at PUC. Now, I started to learn more as soon as I knew that I would have a chance to teach at PUC and live in Brazil and do research there. And what I discovered, and you may enjoy this New York Times reporter's book on Brazil. He has lived in Brazil for many years, worked there as a reporter. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, his wife is Brazilian, so he has that personal insight and connection. He reports in his most recent book, which is on Brazil, that he talked to Clinton's U.S. trade representative in charge of negotiating accords and asked her which country had the most skilled negotiators. Her answer, Brazil. Here's the name of the trade representative, and you have to bear in mind she's describing trade negotiations. That doesn't represent all of international negotiations, but I do think it's relevant. And to quote her, Brazil always sends negotiators who are polished, urbane, warm, sophisticated, and skillful. Brazilians recognize that everyone has interests they need to defend, are able to be charming no matter how contentious the conflict, and look for mutually agreeable solutions, at least compromise. And I was curious. This sounds like NCRP. How do these, and some of these are diplomats, How do these negotiators know how to do some of the basics, at least distributive bargaining, of NCRP? And so I asked my graduate students, while I was at Puke, I taught a course in international conflict resolution to master's and doctoral students in international relations. So I asked them, how has this happened? Now, part of the discussion and the answer is cultural. And if you've ever been to Brazil, if you go perhaps for the World Cup or Summer Olympics, you will see how part of it is cultural. But Brazil also invests a great deal of money in giving their diplomats a top quality negotiation, education, and training. Now, South Africa, since they are part of the BRICS, they're not an emerging economic power. I wish they desperately would need to become that. If that could ever happen, it would benefit the whole African continent. But South Africa is still a rare and exemplary role model for a variety of things, throwing off apartheid. Heads the list. And then after they did that, their negotiation process of their constitution was one of the most inclusive conflict processes I have ever seen. And I write about it some in your assigned reading. So they are a role model if you disregard, economies and look at inclusive participatory NCRP. Now, I'm going back to Brazil. I'm going back and forth here. Primarily, I'm focusing on Brazil. Historically, from an international relations perspective, Brazil is an advocate for multilateralism, for working with the UN and international institutions, organizations, rather than the US doing its thing solo, on its own, without regard for the international community, or any of the Western powers proceeding without the international community. You could argue they're anti-military. They have one of the weakest militaries in the world. It's some of the critique of Brazil as an emerging leader. But thank God they have taken a lead against nuclear weapons, and that actually reflects some of my activism. I was part of the nuclear freeze movement, if you were around for that movement, about the insanity in the world with nuclear buildup. They also have had remarkably peaceful borders and transitions within their own country and with their Latin American neighbors. There would be no way with the US and historic, colonizing international powers to lead a transition from hard to what is called soft power and true multilateralism, international community. We just have too much blood on our hands, both historic and present. Now, Brazil has gained influence throughout the global South, partially because it is a global leader with eradicating poverty through social incentives and rewards. Now, this is very interesting. Unlike the US past welfare system, where welfare recipients became renowned for never working, for being encouraged not to work, Brazil has led a program where parents, for example, receive incentives to send their children to public education rather than to employ their children on the farms or in shops, but does not give them and does not give any of the poor enough that they aren't motivated to work. And this program has been adopted by many global South nation states. Now, on the flip side, the critique of Brazil, there is fierce debate about human rights, Brazil and its relationship to human rights and the international community. At times it becomes very friendly with, for example, Syrian's dictator, or at least hands-off. It tried to insert itself in the Iranian negotiations and is often perceived by the West as abandoning human rights, rule of law, democracy, in its attempts to balance power and be friends with everyone unconditionally. Now, here's some of the other critique. As we have just noted, Brazil is seen as an anti-nuclear weapons buildup advocate. At the same time, it has been developing its own nuclear capacity. Now, truly, this is not unusual. I would say most nation states can be accused of hypocrisy and playing, nasty politics. Brazil, because it has been critiqued, compared to India, which is, I think, the fourth strongest military in the world today, Brazil has, in response to critique about its weakness, grown its military. Now, not surprising if you think about, or if you have studied our current international institutions. The Security Council, for example, was formed after World War II and prioritizes the military might of World War II. That has not changed despite our talk of multilateralism, international community. We still are preferencing as a world, as an international community, military might. So Brazil is now either 20 or 21 strongest in the world. It also, sadly, is a top arms supplier to the world, to the world's wars and military. Brazil and China are both being critiqued about their relationships with African nations. Brazil appears, like the US, to be coming closer and closer to China, which, discussing human rights in China would be like discussing human rights in Israel. And so, given this closeness and attempts at collaboration following China's lead with African nations, people are wondering, including Brazilians, including my students in international relations at PUC, whether Brazil is becoming more like the West than the South, trying to amass power so that it can be more capable of joining the dominant approach to international relations and using carrots and sticks. Now, this is also a quote from the New York Times reporter book that I introduced to you a bit ago. And let me read. Transforming the traditional hard power culture of international conflict resolution through focus on creativity and innovation supporting individual expression rather than military style. Now, I have obviously taken this out of context, but Mr. Roeder is proposing or envisioning that Brazil has this capability if Brazilian culture, rather than attempting to join the West in international conflict resolution, would instead draw on its cultural creativity and innovation. That does support individual expression, and if you are a fan of Brazilian soccer or Brazilian arts, you can see this. It does permeate the culture. And so I am asking, and I asked while I was in Brazil, could Brazil become for international conflict resolution what it has for soccer and the arts? Once again, Roeder says they have an extraordinary ability to take a foreign import and make it into their own, which is basically what innovation is in the world today. Of course, they are not even close to what would be needed to actualize this, but I thought, why not propose to international relations academics, and some of my students were considering taking the equivalent of our State Department Foreign Service test to become diplomats. So I thought, why not propose that Brazil take a lead with providing intensive mediation skill training, similar to what NCRP does in our program, and then promote, which the US and the West actually does, lifelong continuing education and reflective practice with real-world international conflict resolution case studies like the way you are studying and learning about international conflict resolution in this class. Now, the diplomat community around the world, I've had you examine your assumptions and look at, research some of the realities. I'm happy to say they are appreciating the need for mediation and conflict resolution skill education. I think I mentioned UCLA's diplomat in residence coming to our program, meeting our students. I have lectured to former diplomats from India about mediation, and this was part of a more intensive long-term mediation program in India. And so I talked to diplomats who served in Malaysia, Cuba, Iran, different parts of the world about this. Switzerland, I have not been, but Switzerland is showing an interest along with Norway. And Norway is also funding regular mediation gatherings in Africa and Asia. So I'm not alone in proposing this. Now, I asked my students if Brazil could also become a global and a conflict resolution leader with human trafficking, because at the international level, there are such tough, intractable issues and concerns that not only do nation states need to prepare their people to learn how to mediate and negotiate, to the best of their ability, but they also need to be leaders with all these different international concerns. And so I asked them to start doing NCRP analysis with the stakeholders involved with human trafficking. Now, Brazil, I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but Brazil is the most Catholic nation state in the world, and so Pope Francis starting to play a role with mediating behind the scenes with countries like Cuba and the US. And with concerns, Pope Francis is not just concerned with eradication of poverty. The Catholic Church has started to hold regular gatherings of Catholic law enforcement to tackle human trafficking and to tackle corruption, unjust policing in all these Catholic countries. I led them through, and I would suggest you do the same, and actually you are, because I'm having you do negotiation alchemy activities with your international case studies, that you frame collaborative questions, we questions rather than us against them questions, to generate options for mutual gain, to help stimulate ideas in whatever case study you're analyzing. Well, that's enough for today. I hope you have a great week.